So now we have some questions, which first Philip Lane, Professor.
So,
would you just stand up and speak out loud so those at the back can really hear you?
One of the points you make is, in the good years, you need to run a bigger surplus. So given the scale of the boom here, that could have been maybe, 8% surplus of GDP, 10% maybe, because we were running a surplus and public debt did fall. So the question is, how do you deliver, if you tell the electorate, well, this year the surplus is going to be 8%. We're not going to cut taxes. We're going to keep spending low to run this big surplus for fear of a future problem. So, some of the usual recommendations are fiscal rules and maybe the Independent Fiscal Council. How does the Commission view the role of these domestic type reforms in delivering those type of outcomes in the good years?
Thank you for this very important question. I think there are two aspects to this. First of all, if that kind of a growth occurs, at least if it is not sustainable, then in the first place we should have the second pillar in place, to which I refer, by which I refer to the macroeconomic or identifying and preventing of macroeconomic imbalances. So the new framework should help the countries concerned to have a, more sustainable economic development in general, and to avoid such kind of credit booms and real estate bubbles that have happened. The second thing is that yes, national fiscal rules and national fiscal frameworks have proven to be useful. There is actually quite a lot of academic research on this. For instance, Professor Alesin and Professor Wiplots have done research on this. And it shows that the countries that have national fiscal rules and clearly defined national fiscal frameworks of medium-term budgetary objectives with expenditure ceilings by policy area, they have been better able to keep their fiscal house in order. And that's why in my remarks, opening remarks, I recommended that to Ireland. I think in the Irish case that could seriously improve the, medium-term budgetary perspectives and thus lead to more prudent fiscal policy making and thus more sustainable economic growth.
Thank you very much. Pat Cox, former President of the European Parliament.
I was fascinated by your introductory remark, which I think is true, that smaller states put a high premium value on what you call the community method, the alternative being the intergovernmental method. This year, when the Greek crisis was being addressed, President Van Rompuy described putting together the stability mechanism, the fund that went in place, as trying to build a lifeboat while the Union was still floating in the sea. You now have a chance to bring that lifeboat to the dry dock and to do some redesign. Will the redesign be more communautaire or still intergovernmental? And is it possible to strike a balance that is more of the community method, in which smaller states do take legitimate reassurance, and at the same time do it in a light touch way in terms of treaty revision?
Thank you, Pat, for this question. And I recall very well the times when we together defended the community method in the European Parliament. We were first colleagues with Pat in the Liberal group of the European Parliament. Then later on, as I was working in the Commission as head of cabinet, Pat was sacking us as under Commission. Yes, I'm sure in defense of the community method as well. So no hard feelings about that. It's a very serious and pertinent question, and I think you may recall that some of you may have seen that the former Commission President Jacques Delors gave an interview last summer saying that now the job of the firefighters is done, it's the turn of the architects. Well, I agree with him in half, in a sense that yes, we have to focus on the architecture of economic governance and crisis resolution, but certainly, and I think you agree with me, we cannot give up firefighting. We have to continue to work as a fire brigade to contain any possible bushfires of financial instability in Europe. And from this point of view, we have two time perspectives in mind. We have to continue this work in order to ensure financial stability in the euro area, and at the same time we have to redesign and implement the redesign of our economic governance. And in this regard, in fact, the conclusion of the task force the task force presided by Herman van Rompuy is actually very good progress towards the legislative proposals that the Commission put forward. And in that context, I find it particularly important that the sanction regime, which is there to ensure effective enforcement of these rules, should be largely based on what we call reversed majority voting, which would make it much more difficult for large member states to block the Commission's recommendations. And that's a level playing field. That should ensure that the larger and smaller member states have equal rights, and that's really at the heart of the community method. As regards the plans for a permanent crisis resolution mechanism, that is a work in progress, and we are currently doing consultations on how we move forward in the period after 2013, and we will soon come up with concrete proposals.
Professor Jukes, Alan Jukes, former Minister for Finance, Director General here.
Thank you, Brendan. Commissioner, in speaking about your surveillance pillar, you spoke of a graduated response, a series of incentives and sanctions and semi-automatic responses. What kinds of incentives can you imagine for a member state that's doing the right thing about building up a surplus in the good periods, and what kinds of sanctions can be effective when they do the opposite?
Thank you. I think I take both incentives and sanctions. First, on incentives, I think the real world is providing the best incentive. In other words, if you look at how the member states of the European Union have been overcoming the crisis and are now rebounding from the crisis, those countries that had sustainable macroeconomic development and prudent fiscal policy making, plus did structural reforms, especially in the labor market, they have normally done best in the crisis context and in the post-crisis situation. Germany being perhaps the prime example of this, in a sense that Germany has been able to benefit from the export growth in the world market and have been able to benefit from the labor market reforms that were conducted in the first half of the previous decade. Unemployment in Germany did not rise from 3 million to 5 million, which was feared during the crisis, but stayed flat at 3 million and is now being reduced. The same story goes for many other countries around Germany and, say, Austria, the Netherlands, to some extent Finland as well, Sweden. And the comparison to, or the contrast to countries that did not do this kind of reforms and had a weaker fiscal position is quite significant if you take, say, Greece as the ultimate example, or Portugal as another case. On sanctions, I dare to take an example, even though the Finnish ambassador is present here, but this graduation, or say introducing sanctions early enough, which I think is one of the keys of this proposal, indeed implies that they would not be used in the cases like Greece last spring, when the damage was already done, and it would have made no sense of having financial sanctions in a situation to take with your right hand some money out when you are putting money in with your left hand through loans. Meanwhile, it makes sense to have the sanctions as possibility in the preventive arm of the pact already, implying that, for instance, if next spring, after the parliamentary elections in the country I know best, Finland, if there is a completely irresponsible government, say, taking the deficit from 3 to 5%, then we should give a warning, and if there is no corrective action in a few months, there is a sanction in the form of first interest-bearing deposit, then non-interest-bearing deposit, and then as a fine. So it's rather intended to cases like Finland or Luxembourg than the case like Greece in the current context. And just for the Finns to know, it would be about 400 million euros, the sanctions. So please be prudent.
David Byrne, former Commissioner and Attorney General.
You're very welcome, Commissioner. It's a pleasure to see you in Ireland. I'd like to link two concepts you referred to in your presentation. Firstly, the role of the community method, and secondly, your reference to the volatility of markets. In Pat Cox's earlier question, he made reference to the initial strong role at the intergovernmental level to the crisis, and now we're seeing a trend more and more for the community institutions to come into the centre of the play. Is it your belief that the monitoring and surveillance that you referred to, which no doubt will be led by the community institutions, the Commission, your ECB, that this, coupled with perhaps public statements arising from that activity, is likely to give a greater sense of perhaps independence, holding of the ring to the markets, so that when they hear the outcomes of those monitoring and surveillance activities, that it will induce an element of greater calm than we have seen in recent times, where the responses and the activity have tended to be more governmental than communautaire?
Thank you, David. This is indeed a key question of this whole reform, and I think if you look at the new architecture which we will have in place as of next year onwards, it will be introduced somewhat gradually, and I'm speaking about both the new architecture of financial regulation and supervision, and about the new economic governance to which I referred in my opening remarks. The new architecture on financial regulation and supervision will include 3 entities, 3 European supervisory authorities for microprudential supervision, 1 for banking, 1 for securities, and 1 for insurance. And that's a novelty that doesn't exist for the moment, and we would have badly needed this before the crisis. And then on top of this, there will be the European Systemic Risk Board, which sounds quite cryptic, but it combines these 3 supervisory authorities with the European Central Bank and with the Commission. And together our task is to assess possible risks to macrofinancial stability in Europe. So in fact, we are going to have a whole new, architecture or infrastructure for financial and economic analysis in Europe, which I believe will certainly feed into the private sector assessments, to the assessment of investors and other market forces. And when you combine this with the new methods of economic governance, I believe that, in terms of the real economic and real political developments, the community dimension will certainly be reinforced. The European dimension will be reinforced, even though sometimes these institutions work with not with classical community method. So in that sense, they are a major step forward, even if in some instances there are intergovernmental elements. One final point: another new creation, the European Financial Stability Mechanism and Facility, which is usually lumped all together. That's the financial backstop, which was created after the Greek loan package in May, on the weekend of the 9th and 10th of May, at 2 o'clock in the morning, 2:15 a.m. on a Monday morning, 15 minutes after the Asian markets opened. That 500 billion euros is actually divided into two parts: 60 billion euros community instrument and 440 billion euros intergovernmental instrument. And that is there as a financial backstop if there is a serious threat to financial stability in the euro area.
Okay. Could you pass the mic across to Brendan Keenan, who's the economics editor of the Irish Independent Group, the largest print media group in the country, an economist, distinguished economist.
Just to be clear, does the forthcoming 4-year plan and indeed next year's budget require prior Commission approval? And if so, since both are only a few weeks away, what stage are we at?
First, let me thank the Irish Independent. That I think you were one of the papers who got it right, that you don't label me as a professional football player. I was only semi-professional. There's a difference. We got daily allowances. I don't say how much, but we got daily allowances. It's great fun. I mean, I'm not a football fan. It's just the way of life. So anyway, on the 4-year plan and on the budget. The way the European Union works in economic and fiscal surveillance is that following the recommendation of the Commission, the Council, that's the ministers of the Member States, the Council takes the decision on the common economic and fiscal policy stance of the European Union. And that's done before the time of the budget is approved and before the time of the medium-term budgetary plan. And it is expected that the Member States will plan and decide their budget and mid-term fiscal plan according to this common stance, which they have themselves been part of agree. I mean, every Member State is part of the Council, and the Council decisions should bind every Member State of the European Union. And our task is to conduct surveillance and assess compliance with these common rules and joint decisions of the Council. So in that sense, yes, we are following very closely the preparations, but it is the responsibility of the government of Ireland to decide on the draft budget for next year, as well as on the 4-year fiscal plan. And once we see the result of that work, we will then hopefully be able to endorse this plan, which should enhance the credibility of the Irish sovereign and Irish economy.
One last question, and might go across here to the corner, Professor Kinsella. You can skip her over there. Thank you, Jill. Professor Ray Kinsella, who specialises in banking, UCD. He's over there.
Commissioner, a very special welcome to Ireland. When you welcomed the government's fiscal consolidation proposals a few days ago of taking an extra 6 billion out of the economy this year, you referred to it as contributing to continued economic growth. Now, the Irish economy has contracted by 11% in 2008 and 2009. In the first half of 2010, it's contracted on a year-to-year basis by 2%, and it's forecast by the OECD and by the EU to contract by at least 1% this year. So I'm not clear where the economic recovery is coming from, and I'm less clear how taking 6 billion, which is double the projected amount last year, out of the economy is going to make it remotely feasible to achieve the 4% or the 3% budget target in 3 short years.
Thank you for this very pertinent question concerning the Irish economy. We first say how we do economic and fiscal policy overall in Europe in this regard. We have decisions. We have taken decisions together to have a coordinated and differentiated strategy of fiscal exit from the stimulus measures which were taken in most of the countries of the European Union in between 2008 and 2010. And the aim is that all those countries who can afford it, they will continue fiscal stimulus until the end of this year. So last year and this year have been quite substantially stimulative fiscal stances, while those countries that have no fiscal space left, Greece, of course, being the obvious example, but also Portugal, Spain, and Ireland, they need to start fiscal consolidation as soon as possible in an intensified manner. And as we know, Ireland was in fact among the first, if not the first, to start fiscal consolidation. And therefore, I mean, why is this done? Because we want to ensure that in the euro area, in Europe overall, everybody is not at the same time rushing to fiscal exit, which would suffocate economic growth. Instead, we aim at doing it in a coordinated and gradual way, so that those countries who still can afford, like Germany is stimulating more this year than last year. So these countries continue fiscal stimulus, while the other countries that have no fiscal space, they will intensify their fiscal consolidation. And for Ireland, this is a dilemma, because Ireland will have to balance two things. On the one hand, targeting credibility through a convincing and front-loaded fiscal consolidation program, while at the same time trying to minimize the negative impact on economic growth on the other hand. And we have assessed the situation, and we agree with the government, and so does the European Central Bank agree with the government that, even though I don't speak for the ECB normally, but I know that they are in agreement on this. So we agree that the reduction of 6 billion euros of the fiscal deficit is an appropriate level of fiscal consolidation in the case of Ireland to strike a balance between these two difficult objectives.
I think that's a very appropriate point at which to bring the proceedings to a close. In thanking you for your contribution and referring back to the similarities that you had identified between Ireland and Finland, as had Daithí Ó Ceallaigh, I hadn't realised until now that a sense of humour was something we shared in common.
Absolutely, absolutely.
We normally attribute quite a different characteristic to our friends from Finland. So I want to thank you very much for having put that part of the record straight. In respect of economic and monetary union and our role within it, it's another feature of our shared history that we were part of an economic and monetary union, most particularly part of a monetary union, since 1826. And we had to take very serious decisions, which we did, on gaining independence, about what our strategy would be in respect of that particular role. And our decision taken probably in 1979 to join the EMS, one of the most important in our independence, It's a decision we took with eyes wide open. And it wasn't that we were not warned along the way as to what EMU would entail, not least from that very podium there, from no less a person than Hans Tietmar, and indeed Jean-Claude Trichet, and in the first instance, Baron Lamfalussy, the first president of the EMI. I think and we also would recall that it was in this town that the rules for the Stability and Growth Pact were forged and agreed under an Irish presidency. I think it may, however, be said that we forgot the rules which you have so eloquently outlined, and the strengthening of which you have indicated to us is now on the agenda, along lines that we can only agree with. We have a responsibility as being part of a monetary union to abide by the rules, to help strengthen them, and that's a mutual responsibility we share with other member states. If we have been lax in that regard in the past decade or so, I think you will go away from here with a strong sense of feeling that this will not happen again, and that we will put our own house in order. I think it's very important, and the point did come up and you addressed it yourself, that we've got to achieve a balance between fiscal rectitude on the one hand and a growth strategy on the other. You've referenced the difficulty of achieving that. And in order to achieve credibility, not least with the markets, but may I say the growth strategy is, of course, politically important in order to ensure acceptability amongst the electorate for what it is we're doing. But indeed also from an macroeconomic point of view to ensure that we have the largest possible denominator so that the macroeconomic indices all move in the right direction. Now, whether we do that or not as quickly as we would wish to, I don't know. But what I'm absolutely convinced about, and I want you to leave with this conviction, that we are going to do this. One of the things that we do rather well is we learn from mistakes. Now, the fact that we make mistakes in the first place, of course, is neither here nor there. But we do learn from mistakes, and we learn fairly rapidly. And when we learn, we stick with what it is we've learned. You've been a great help to us in rethinking our strategy. I think your presence here this afternoon and last evening is a great sense of reassurance to us that the community method will be employed, and that the principle of mutual solidarity between the member states is being enhanced and given the most practical of expression here in our current circumstances and difficulties. And for that we owe you a particular gratitude and thanks. And I want to say that you will always be welcome back here again in either your personal or professional capacity. Thank you very much for being with us.